So before Abosai, we start the shir today on Daf Mem Ches with the Mishnah 4 lines down from the top. We just wanted to add one piece to yesterday's shir, and that is Pazar Kasha. These are the 6 unique mitzvot that apply to Shmini Atzeres as an independent holiday separated from the rest of the Chag HaSukkot. So even though we call it the 8th day, it really has a personality of its own. And the Pei stands for pious, which means that when they divided up the Mishmaros, and especially on Yom Tov, when many Mishmaros had a chance to do the Avodah, so for the Avodah of the day, they had a lottery, and there was a separate lottery for Shmini Atzeres. The Zion is Man, and here the Gemara paskins that we recite Shechiyanu on Shmini Atzeres as a new, independent, unique Kedusha Sayom. Of course, the question that we have to ask is, isn't that obvious? And we don't find in the Gemara anyone who disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan, says that Shmini Atzeres requires its own Shechiyanu. However, if you recall, the Gemara tried to prove from a Brisa that Rabbi Yochanan is correct, and the Gemara rejected that and said that the bracha element of Shmini Atzeres only refers to Tefillah or Birkas HaMazon. So the Gemara seems to be pushing against Rabbi Yochanan. And maybe there is some sort of phantom sheet out there. We don't know who he is. Some anonymous, faceless Amora who held that Shmini Atzeres is part of and an extension of Sukkot, and therefore doesn't require its own Zman. But here clearly, this Brisa is assuming that there is Zman. Then the Reish of Pazar is Regel B'fnei Atzmo, and that means that with regard to Sukkah, we leave the Sukkah and re-enter the house. Rashi says 7 lines down from the top, She'ein yochvim b'sukkah. Rashi seems to indicate that sitting in the Sukkah is antithetical to Shmini Atzeres, because Shmini Atzeres means leave the Sukkah and go back to the house. Then we have Kashav, which is Karban. We have a whole set of Karbanos that are brought on Shmini Atzeres. For example, we only have one par. And instead of the numbers of parim that are brought during Sukkot that decrease from 13 down to 7, we have one par. And normally, if Shmini Atzeres would not be considered Karban B'fnei Atzmo, but rather a Hemshech, it would have 6 parim. Also, as we mentioned, with regard to the Kfasim and the Elim, it's a whole different set of numbers. It's not 14 Kfasim, it's only 7 Kfasim, it's not 2 Elim, it's only 1 Eil, etc., etc. Then we have Shira B'fnei Atzma, and if you recall, all the Shira that the Leviim sang during the course of Sukkot, they all had one central theme, Rashi says, and that is the Aniyim that we have to, during this harvest season, we have to give stock to the Aniyim. But on Shmini Atzeres, we have a separate Shira, Lamnatzeach Alagitis, and that has nothing to do with the Aniyim. Then we have a Bracha B'fnei Atzma, and that refers to both Birkas HaMazon and Shmona Esrei, Shmini Chag HaTzeres Hazeh, and we don't call it Chag HaSukkos. And now we begin the daf for today with the Mishnah, which is 4 lines down from the top. Hallel v'simcha shmona. The mitzvah of Hallel includes not just the 7 days of Pesach, of Sukkot, but also extends to include the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeres. Now, Simcha also is generated by Shmini Atzeres. The Gemara is going to ask how we know this. But keep in mind that when we speak about Simcha, we're not just talking about dancing and singing. That's always a good idea the whole year round. But we're talking about shechting a carbon shlomim and eating the meat of the carbon. Now, if we postulate that on Shmini Atzeres, there is a mitzvah of Simcha, which the is outspoken about, then we're going to have to shech this carbon the day before Shmini Atzeres. That's because there's no shlomim that can be brought on Shmini Atzeres itself. But that's okay because the previous day is the last day of Sukkot, which is Chol HaMoed, and therefore we can check the carbon, Shlomim, and eat its meat, because Shlomim is eaten for 2 days, and therefore we can eat the meat on Shmini Atzeres. Ketzad, and the Mishnah now goes into detail. Malamed shechayev adam b'hal u'besimcha u'bekavod yantiv ha'achman shel chag. Notice, if you will, that the Mishnah adds another extra word here. It had Halil and Simcha for 8 days, and now it adds Kavod, meaning that Yantiv Achron Shel Chag, which is Shmini Atzeres, generates a Chiyuv Kavod. And you might ask, why did the Mishnah have to bother telling me that? Every Yantiv has a mitzvah Kavod. In fact, could be the Chol HaMoed has a mitzvah Kavod. So what's the Chiddush here in Kavod? But as we'll soon see, that mitzvah kavod requires that we organize our meals on Erev Yontif. The mitzvah kavod, unlike the mitzvah oneg is a mitzvah on Shabbos, on Yontif. Kavod is on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif. And with regard to the Sukkah, this sets up a problem, almost a contradiction in terms, because we don't want to go into the Sukkah to eat our meals on Shmini Atzeres, and that's because, as we said before, Shmini Atzeres is a regel b'fnei atzmo, which Rashi identifies as ein yoshim. But on the other hand, certainly in Chutz La'aretz, it goes without saying that we want to sit in Sukkah, as we discussed yesterday, on Shmini Atzeres. So we have a kind of a contradiction in terms, and the mitzvah of kavod, as we'll soon see, is going to play a major role in sifting through that, what I call an apparent contradiction. Shar kol yemei safek.
Kavod means preparing food
before the yontif, or preparing the table, right? If you set up your table before you, a lot of people, by the way, it's not the place to harangue here with a mussar, but you should know a lot of people will organize their table Friday night, after the balabais comes home from shul. That's really not right. Again, this is not the place and the time for a mussar shmuz, but the mitzvah kavod is on Erev Shabbos. So organizing your table should be beforehand.
You are allowed to cook if you needed to.
No problem with cooking on Yom Tov. But if you cook on Erev Yom Tov, you get an additional kiyum of kavod Yom Tov. So you get 2 for the price of 1. But in the case of Sukkot, if you're going to organize on the 7th day of Sukkot, your table for the night going into the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeres, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of kavod vis-a-vis Shmini Atzeres, you've got yourself a problem. Because what you're going to do is you're going to walk into a sukkah on Shmini Atzeres that's totally prepared. And that means that you're not going there for reasons of convenience, but you're going there for the mitzvah of sukkah. Let me lead into it as we go through the sukkah. The Gemara says, Minani milu. How do we know that there's a mitzvah of simcha with regard to Shmini Atzeres? And if you look at the psukim in the Torah, in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Zayin, you will see that the Torah formulates the mitzvah of simcha with regard to Sukkot. Now we're talking about Shmini Atzeres as a regular b'fnei atzmo. So how do we know, from whence do we derive that Shmini Atzeres as a separate holiday requires simcha? You're going to have to find some drasha, some yalfusa that teaches you the mitzvah of simcha on Shmini Atzeres. And the Gemara says, from Rabbana, the Brisa derives it from Vayisa Ach Sameach. There are 2 psukim in the context of Sukkot, and the Torah repeats itself twice in the context of a unit of psukim. And if you want to look it up, I'll just offer you that possibility. Opening up the Chumash is always a good idea. It's just that I'm pressured for time, so I can't do that. But if you take a look to Dvarim, Perek, right, we're in Dvarim now, and we're in Perek Tes Zayin. Perek Tes Zayin, in English it would be 16, And we're looking at Pasuk Yud Gimel and then Pasuk Yud Dalet. And you'll see a certain repetition with regard to the mitzvah of Simcha. You want to read it out loud, just very quickly? I think it should be Pasuk Yud Gimel, Pasuk Yud Dalet, Pasuk Tesvav. Okay, you don't have to read all those words, but you see it's talking about Sukkot. Right. Oh, you see that? There's another extra pasuk. That's the pasuk that our Raisa quotes. And both psukim are in the context of Sukkot. Obviously, the redundancy forces us to add another day for Simcha. L'Rabos Leil Yontif Achron, which means the night going from 7 to 8 requires Simcha. And that's going to mean that we've got to eat basar shlamim on the night of Shmini Atzeres. Now, there's no carbon shlamim that's brought at night. The Mikdash is closed for business at night, but we're going to have to bring a carbon shlamim on the last day of Sukkot and then eat the basar on the night of Shmini Atzeres. And that's derived from the redundancy of Vayisa Ach Sameach. The Brisa asks a question on itself. O Eina El Yontif HaRishon. Maybe we need a special ribui for the night going into Sukkot. That means Tes Vav, the 15th of Tishrei. Because once again, that would mean that you'd have to bring a carbon shlamim on the 14th of Tishrei, Erev Sukkot, in order to guarantee that you have the meat of shlamim to eat in the sukkah on the night of the 15th. So the Gemara, the Bryce itself gives the following answer. True, we have a ribui, but we also have a mute. Kishu Omer Ach Chilek. Ach means a mute. So we have Vayisa Ach Samech as a ribui, but the word Ach itself is a mute. So what are we going to do? We're going to assume the following, that the ribui teaches me that the night going into Shmini Atzeres requires simcha, and we're going to have to bring the carbon. We're going to have to bring the carbon on the 7th day of Sukkot. And the miyud of Ach is going to exclude the first night of Yontif. You don't have to bring a carbon shlamim on Erev Yontif, on the 14th of Tishrei going into Sukkot, in order to guarantee that you have the meat of shlamim to eat on the night, the first night of Sukkot. So the Gemara asks, Umara Isa. This is such a classic Gemara, methodologically. How do you know if you have a ribui to mute, which way to go? L'Rabos Leila Yontif HaAchron, L'Hotzi Leila Yontif HaRishon. Why not say it the other way around? Why not say that the ribui is teaching me the night going into Yontif, and the mute is excluding the night of Shmini Atzeres? And the Gemara answers, Marba ani leila yontif ha'achron she'ein simcha lefanov, u'motzi ani leila yontif ha'rishon she'ein simcha lefanov. In both these cases, the night going into Sukkot, the night going into Shmini Atzeres, the previous day is going to be the time period designated for the carbon shlamim. And that's going to set up a mitzvah of simcha, so that night, the following night, we can eat the basar, we can have a mitzvah of simcha. Now you have two choices. You can either do this on Erev Yontif, meaning going into Sukkot, or on the 7th day of Sukkot, Erev Shmini Atzeres. It makes more sense to assume that we're going to bring the carbon shlamim on Erev Shmini Atzeres, which is a day of Yontif anyway, because it's the 7th day of Simcha. So we already have a mitzvah and a kiyum of Simcha. It makes sense within that context to require that we bring a carbon shlamim for the purpose of Simcha. But in the case of Erev Sukkot, with all due respect to Erev Sukkot, a very nice time period, we have a lot to do at Erev Sukkot, but we're not obligated in the mitzvah of Simcha. It's Erev Yontif. It doesn't have any Kiddush Sayom. and certainly doesn't generate any mitzvah of simcha. So to require that we bring a korban shlamim on Erev Sukkot because of the mitzvah of simcha on the night of Sukkot, that's less of a tenable position, less attractive than to require on a day of Sukkot, meaning the seventh day of Sukkot, which is endowed with Kedushas Hayom and a mitzvah simcha. That is a more appropriate time to require a korban shlamim and a mitzvah simcha.
I don't know if it's wrong, but don't offer a korban shlamim on the first day.
What I'm saying is that we don't bring a korban shlamim on Erev Sukkot. You're asking a different question, but at Erev Sukkot, that's what the Gemara is focused on, in order to guarantee that have basar shlamim on the night of Sukkot. Let's begin the Mishnah because the clock is moving. Now, this Mishnah really relates to the opening Mishnah in our parak. Because what we're going to begin to discuss now, which is, at least to some extent, the subject of the Mishnah that opened up our parak, is the mitzvah of Sukkah Shiva. And what that means is that we have to finish up with our Sukkah. Let's talk about Eretz Yisrael for a moment, on the seventh day. And once we finish up our mitzvah of Sukkah, we can theoretically take apart the Sukkah. But again, what's the rush? Why do we have to rush into taking apart the Sukkah on the seventh day? And the answer might be because on the eighth day, as we said over and over again, it always bears repetition. Rashi has already spilled the beans here, that the essence of Shmini Atzeres is to leave the sukkah, return it to the house. So we may be in a rush, so to speak, to leave the sukkah. But on the other hand, either in Eretz Yisrael, in a case where a person doesn't have a place in his house to eat his Suda on Shmini Atzeres, or in Chutz La'aretz, where there's Yom Tov Sheni Shel Goliath, therefore he has to eat in sukkah on the eighth day. So the Mishnah says, Sukkah Shiva Ketzah. Gamar Milecha. He's finished his meal on Sukkot, meaning on the seventh day of Sukkot. This is the, we'll call it Hoshana Rabbah Su'uda. And l'chora at this point, he should just clear out all his kalim from the Sukkah and announce that he is no longer using this Sukkah. Lo yatir Sukkos. And the Mishnah tells us, to our surprise, that, you know what? You never know. Even if he ate his Suda, maybe he wants to take a nap, maybe he wants to talk to his friend and take a little spatzir and get some air, he has to go out into the sukkah because it's before Shkia. Don't take apart the sukkah. The entire day, the seventh day, is included in the mitzvah of sukkah. However, he's not eating another Suda. He's eaten all the Suda. And he's got lots of kalim that he used for the entire balance of Sukkot, that he should take it out from the Sukkah, clear it out, and bring it into the house. Why is he in a rush to take out his kalim? And the answer is because in event that he will go into the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres to eat a meal, or alternatively in Chutz La'aretz where he's required to go into the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres to eat a meal, then he wants to make it clear that he's not eating in the sukkah because of the mitzvah of sukkah. And the Meiri points out that if it would seem and appear to the spectator that he's eating in sukkah on Shmini Atzeres for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah, that would look to the eyes of the spectator as Baal Tosef, as if he's adding another day to the 7 days of Chag. And therefore, the Mishnah recommends that he take his kalim out of the sukkah. Once he takes his kalim out of the sukkah, he's already made a public announcement that there is no longer a mitzvah of sukkah. That action is tantamount to wearing a sign that says, we're finished with the mitzvah of sukkah. If I go ahead and I eat in the sukkah, That's because I have no other place to eat, or perhaps because I'm doing it because I have a suffix in Chutz La'aretz, whether it might be the 7th day of Sukkah. But as far as Shmini Atzeres is concerned, I've removed my kalim and I've made that public announcement. This is not a mitzvah of Sukkah. Now, you may ask me, does he gain anything by taking his kalim out, other than avoiding Bal Tosif, or what might look Marasayin of Bal Tosif? And the Mishnah adds another explanation. The Mishnah says, now, remember that we saw in the Mishnah, the previous Mishnah on top of the Yomud, that on Shmini Atzeres, there's a mitzvah of kavod. So now, what he's going to do is, he's going to take out the kelim. Now, there's a paradox in this Mishnah, because taking out the kelim does not seem like preparing a Suda for Yontif. So one of the questions that we'll have to, at some point, come to grips with is, why are we taking out the kelim for kavod Yontif? I understand that we're taking out the kelim in order to make this public declaration, wave the flag that we're not interested in the mitzvah of Sukkah. On Shmini Atzeres, that would be a Bal Tosif. But now the Mishnah is offering another explanation, another reason why we're obligated to take out the kelim, and that is Mishum Kavod Yontif. What does that mean, Kavod Yontif? You're telling me that I take out my kelim, I remove them, Mishum Kavod Yontif? In any event, the Gemara asks the following question: Ein lo kelim lahorid mahu. He wants to make a public statement that he's not fulfilling the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. But what if he has no kelim? Ein lo kelim. What does that mean? Ein lo kelim. Ela ki yishtamish ma yishtamish. How did he use this sukkah for 7 days? He must have had kelim. Ela, you have to reformulate the question. Ein lo makom lahorid kelim ma. How can he demonstrate that he's no longer going into the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah if he has no place to store his kelim? Again, you might ask, what do you mean he has no? Where did he store his kelim the whole year? Why is he having a problem finding a place for his kelim? I don't know.
Dishes,
Correct. Pots, pans, dishes. All he has to take out is pots and pans. He better leave some chairs in the sukkah so he can sit in the sukkah. Rab Chia bar Ashi Omar, what demonstration can he make that he's not interested in the mitzvah of sukkah? Hoches ba'arba, he should take out the schach for a width of 4 tfachim, and that would certainly passel the sukkah. Now, there's a problem here because you can passel a sukkah with 3 tfachim. Why does Rav Ashi mention, or Rav Chia, why does he mention 4 tfachim? So some say that what he did was he put some schach there. It was not schach kosher. So he made a demonstration, but there's a difference between avir sukkah. Avir sukkah passes 3 tfachim. Schach posel is posel the arba tfachim. So we're talking about a mitzvah where he has schach posel. And that doesn't pass in the sukkah unless you have a width of 4 tfachim. Now again, Rab Chia's option is irrelevant in Chutz La'aretz, because in Chutz La'aretz he's got to sit in a kosher sukkah. So then perhaps we can take Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's option, Omar, Madlik ba es haner. And normally, if you have a small sukkah, which is Sheva Tfachim by Sheva Tfachim, we don't light a candle inside the sukkah because of security reasons. But here, it seems like they made a special dispensation and they allowed you to bring in the ner. Again, you have to be very careful with the ner, but they would allow this in order to, again, make that demonstration that it's not a mitzvah of sukkah. So the Gemara says, lo plig. There's no fundamental contention here between Rabbi Chia and Levi, but rather holon v'holahu. Now, the word lon in Shas, when it's referring to a question of Eretz Yisrael or Chutz La'aretz, Eretz Yisrael or Bavel, Lon means Chutz La'aretz, which means Bavel, because the Talmud is the Talmud Bavel. And Hol Lon now is referring to Rabbi Shua ben Levi's recommendation about the candle. Why? Because it cannot be that in Bavel we're going to accept Rabbi Chia's recommendation, because that would pass the Sukkah, and in Bavel we need to sit in Sukkah on the 8th day. All we need is to make some sort of demonstration that we're only doing this because we don't know, maybe it's the 7th day, it's not the 8th day, but it's really not the mitzvah of Sukkah, because that would undermine the sanctity of Shmini Atzeres. But Holahu, in the case of Eretz Yisrael, where there's absolutely no obligation to sit in Sukkah on the 8th day, we know it's the 8th day, and it's Shmini Atzeres, all you want to do is quiet down, quell the spectators from suspecting you of Baal Tosif. So then, what you have to do is you pass on the Sukkah. The Gemara asked about Rabbi Shimon Levi, "Ateinach Sukkah Ketana Sukkah Gedola Ma'ikal U'Meimah." You know, in the case of a Sukkah Ketana, we normally don't allow you to light a candle. So you've demonstrated that you're not interested in the mitzvah of Sukkah. However, if you have a Sukkah Gedola that's larger than 7 by 7 tefachim, then what demonstration have you achieved by lighting a candle? I think our answer is we have to offer another alternative suggestion for a case of Sukkah Gedola. That is the Mi'ayel Bey Monei Michla. Now, Michla means Achila in Aramaic. Monei means Kalim. And Ma'ayel Bey means to bring up. And what the word Monei Michla, that phrase, means in this context is Kalim that you've already used for food. The Amar Rava, Monei Michla bar mi metalalot. Monei Mishtia bim metalalot. What does this mean? I think we've discussed this in the past. That the law of Sukkah and the Kedusha therein, now you might ask me, probably personally, give me a break. Sukkah is Kedusha. And it does have an element of Kedusha. We saw in the Gemara on Daf Tes that the Pasuk Lashem is used to describe Sukkah. You're not allowed to benefit from the Sukkah. You can't take the schach and use it for your purposes. A Sukkah has Kedusha to it. In fact, the Bir Allah has a whole discussion about Tashmish Amida, to be the kind of mitzvah of honor in a Sukkah. But certainly, if you have to go to the bathroom, you have to go out of the Sukkah, it's such and such. One of the laws that reflects the special Kedusha that we have vis-a-vis the Sukkah is that once we finish eating, and again, I give a Muslim respect that people are not mocked, you have to clear out the dishes. However, if you're drinking, then drinking dishes do not get soiled to the point where they're repulsive. So Rava says we're allowing you to leave, but since he wants to demonstrate publicly that this is not a sukkah, and he's not sitting there because he wants to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. So what he does is we allow him to leave soiled dishes in the sukkah. And that's a public statement that he's not sitting in the sukkah in order to be mekayim the mitzvah of sukkah.
Drinking.
No, I'm saying we're going to allow him dispensation, special heter, to leave his eating dishes after he finishes eating in the sukkah. We normally don't allow it. The sukkah doesn't tolerate that kind of repulsive dishes. Get them out. That's what you have to do. But on this case of Shmini Atzeres, in order to allow you to demonstrate that here you are in Chutz La'aretz, and you have to eat in sukkah, but you want to demonstrate that it's not the real McCoy mitzvah of sukkah, because otherwise you're undermining and contradicting the Kedusha of Shmini Atzeres. So we're going to give you special allowance to leave your eating dishes in the sukkah. And now we get to the Mishnah of Nisuch HaMayim. So the subject of Nisuch HaMayim is going to occupy our minds for quite a while, and this is where it begins. And we're going to need some help from some of the diagrams and the pictures here, which we have prepared, in order to understand, which direction the Mizbeach goes in. And just, to shoot from the hip, so to speak, you'll have to keep in mind that the Mizbeach goes from south to north. And you may ask me, what's the big deal? Why would I think otherwise? The answer is because the rest of the Mikdash goes from east to west. So, for example, when you enter into the Mikdash, you're coming in from the Mizrach. And as you get deeper in, you enter through the Ulam, and then from the Ulam into the Heichal, and from the Heichal into the Kodesh Kadashim. You're always going from east to west, but that's not true for the Mizbech. It's like an L, if you follow it. It's not parallel, but rather it's perpendicular. Did I get that right? Yeah, perpendicular, 90-degree angle. So whereas the Mikdash goes from east to west, the Mizbeach goes from south to north. And what we're going to see is that when we say that it goes from south to north, it means that the Kevesh is on the south side. And the Gag HaMizbeach, where the Maracha is, where the flame is, that is on the north side. So when you're going up the ramp, moving from south to north, in order to arrive at the eastern, let's call it the southeastern corner, because again, everything we discussed today is about the southeastern corner of the Mizbeach, you are going to turn to your right. Okay? And we'll see that there's a principle in Kodshim that Kol Pnei Yosecha Ein El Yamin. We always turn to the right. That's going to have tremendous repercussions here for us. Now, the Mishnah opens up with 3 words, Nisuch Hamayim Keitzach. This is a little bit tricky because later on, towards the end of the Masechet Sukkah, we're going to learn about what we do on the night of Sukkot, every single night. And that's called Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Now, within the context of Simchas Beis HaShoeva, we're going to have 3 sets of blowing the trumpets. We're going to blow the trumpet, and we're always moving towards the Ezras Nashim. And there are steps. Anyway, we don't have to go into all the detail because we're going to have that later on in Masechta, but we should know that our Mishnah is sort of like a frame in the middle of a long seret, the middle long movie. And the beginning of the movie is going to be in the Mishnayos later on. And there we're going to learn about, preparing step by step for the Nisach HaMayim. But here, we're talking about the Nisach HaMayim on the day, 7 days of Sukkot. And that is brought together in context with, number 1, the Tamid Shel Shachar. Okay, so all the night activities going into the day we finish with, and that's in the Mishnayos later on. And now we're ready for Nisach HaMayim on the day itself. The first question is, where do they draw the water from? And that's called Mei Shiloach, which is a natural spring that's right outside Yerushalayim. And they drew the water, as the Mishnayos at the end of the Masechta will describe. And then they have to do the Nisa, to pour the water on the Mizbeach. Now, the lumdus here, which again is much more for an Iyun shir, but you have to keep in mind that Nisach HaMayim, which takes place only 7 days out of the entire year, is very closely related to and almost integrated with Nisach HaYayim. Nisach HaYayim is something that took place every single day of the year. And you and I might think, what's the connection here between Nisach HaYayim and Nisach HaMayim? Why would we even think of sort of integrating them? And you'll see that the pouring of the Yayin on the Mizbech and the pouring of the water, the Mayim on the Mizbech, both have to take place simultaneously. Now, how can you do both? They're in different kalim, and ostensibly you can't mix them together. Rambam has a very unique shita that if you mix them together, it's still kosher. You can yotzei both mitzvahs of Nisach Mayim and Yayin when you mix it together. And again, the Rishonim can't fathom this, Rabbi, because we have a psul in yayin called mazud, meaning if it's too diluted. So if you added water, which is 3 lugim according to Tanakh, together with the yayin, you have diluted. But anyway, that's not for us. The only point I wanted to make is, and this will give us a framework within which we can understand Nisuch HaMayim, is that it's got to be synchronized together with Nisuch HaYayin. And again, these are all mystical concepts of what Mayim represents and what Yayin represents and why they have to be interrelated and synchronized. In general, the entire enterprise of Nisuch HaMayim is all mystical. Now, pouring wine on the Mizbech, that I can begin to understand. But pouring water on the Mizbech, that's very strange. In fact, this became a subject and a victim of all the attacks of the stupid. I mean, there is no makar in the Torah for Nisuch HaMayim. The whole enterprise of Nisuch HaMayim is derived from Allah Moshe Sinai. The Gemara is going to try to find an esmachta, a mem here, and a yud here, and another mem here. But it's all rabbinic in origin, in the sense that it's Allah Moshe Sinai, Torah Sheba'al Peh. And it's mind-boggling, Nisuch HaMayim. There's a famous medrash that when God created the world, so the pasuk says that He brought the mayim down from Shamayim. Those are called mayim tachtonim. The lower waters, there were mayim that were up in the sky, up in the heavens, and they were close to the Ribono Shalom. So the mayim tachtonim came in front of the Kisei HaKavod to complain. As we say, why did you cut me out here? And I'm down here in the lower world. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to calm them down and console them by promising them that on 7 days out of the year, you'll be up there. Because as a result of Nisuch HaMayim, it's like the Mayim from the heavens somehow come down to the earth. Very mystical concepts. And in truth, all of Shmini Atzeres is mystical. But be that as it may, Slochit shel Zav, Masechet shel Lugim, Vayimemale min HaShiloach. So from the Shiloach, which we said is right outside the old city of Yerushalayim, there's a spring of natural water. Because the pasuk says, "Ushavtem mayim b'sason mimaynei ha'yeshua." The word mimaynei, ma'ayan, means a spring water. So the Shiloach is a spring water. And that's kosher for Nisuch HaMayim. And we do a she'iva, which we draw the water from the Shiloach with great simcha. You'll see about the tkiyos in a minute. Because true tkiyah is always, in the case of chatzotza, so I'm not talking about shofar, is always an act of simcha. It's a kiyum simcha, but also inspires and generates simcha. And this Nisuch HaMayim is all about simcha. Now notice that the Mishnah requires a tzlucha shel zahav. Rabbi Yehuda is going to disagree, but zahav obviously is something very special, very expensive. And we'll soon see that it's not a kli sharetz. It cannot be a kli sharetz because then we'd have problems with what's called lina. But again, that's futuristic. Let's leave that out. And then the Mishnah requires 3 lugim of mayim. And that's an interesting question. Where do we get 3 lugim from? Because in the case of yayin, the Torah tells me that we need 3 lugim of yayin. Because it says revius hayayin, revius hahin, which is equal to a revius, which is equal to 3 lugim, as we'll see in Mitzvah. But in any event, part of the halacha Moshe Sinai apparently was that we need a minimum volume of 3 lugim. That's the sheet of the Tanakama, and Rabbi Yehuda is going to reduce it down to 1 lugim. Higiu l'shar hamayim. So I just want to apologize because whenever I see Shar HaMayim, I always think of Richard Nixon. What again? Okay. That's my problem. I can never divorce this from. He had a problem with tapes. My father once walked into Rav Soloveitchik's office, and there were tapes like lying all over the place. So my father said to Rav Soloveitchik, You remind me of Nixon. So the Rav said, what are you talking about? I says, you also have problems with tapes. Anyway. So what happens when they reach the Sharamayim? Now again, the Sharamayim was a place where they kept the water in such a way that it was not sanctified in a klishares, so that it could be there overnight. So we did the she'iva of the mayim, let's say at night, we drew the water from the Meshivah, we put it in containers, in barrels, and we stored it in Watergate. And the reason why it's important to store it in Watergate is that it should not be in a klishares, otherwise it becomes possible lina. You're not allowed to leave water overnight. There's a whole sugya in Masechet Yoma about what's called mei kiyar, which is the water that they use for Kiddush Yadayim burnt wine. How would you leave that overnight from one day to the other? And it should become possible with lina. And the Gemara says they developed a very sophisticated system in which the mei kiyar was sort of like lowered down into the kiyar, and they were in a certain kli, and therefore there was no psul of lina. Taku ve'riu v'taku. Again, we'll see later on that this is nothing new. They did this 3 times before, but this is the final set of tkiyos b'chatzotzros, which engenders simcha. And I don't know if you travel in New York by car, but if you do, in New York City, I mean, then you'll know what I mean by 10-10 winds. So why do I mention 10-10 winds? Because if you want to know where the pasuk about Chatzotzos is, it's 10-10 Bamidbar. What's that called in English? Whatever. Anyway,
10th chapter,
10th chapter, 10th pasuk. And there it says, Ubiyom simchaschem u'moadechem roshei chodshechem utakatem b'chatzotzos. So on any day that's endowed with simcha, and even Rosh Chodesh has a theme of simcha, then we blow the chatzotzos. And I think I mentioned that this organization called Machon Hamikdash, they already have chatzotzos.
Yeah.
I have my own comments about that, but not for now. Anyway, so now all of a kevesh upano l'smola. Okay, here's where these pictures might come in hand. The kevesh goes up from the Durham towards the tzafon. Okay, now. See. So which of these?
on the left, around.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to figure out. I'm sorry. Oh, no. Sorry, I got myself. Coming up the cash from wrong. Yeah, it's perpendicular to the brush. There. Looking that drone is right. It's facing his bed. Sorry, I had this morning at 4:30, but now I don't have it. If he's coming up the kevesh, he's going oh, okay. Now I got my mistake. Sorry, I apologize. I'm confusing this with another sugi that I'm learning in a different Masechet. Sorry. the Nisach HaMayim, just like to write here, but the Nisach HaMayim is not in the east, but in the west. I got mixed up here. So this is where the Nisach HaMayim is going to be, on this corner of the Mizbech. You see that? So if he's coming up from south, going up north, then he's going to have to turn to his left to go west, right? Because the Mikdash is east to west. And what that's going to mean also is that if let's say you have Kohanim coming out this way, then the first corner that they're going to meet up with in the Mizbeach is going to be the southwestern corner. Okay, then? So now coming up from the south and turning towards the west means turning towards your left. You see that? Mm-hmm. Turning towards your left. Okay. Sorry, I made that one mistake because in other sugyas, with regard to Olas HaOf, we need the southeastern corner of the Mizbeach. Okay, fine. So now, Shnei Sfalim Shel Kesef Hayusham. So there were two Sfalim. Now, Sfalim are receptacles. And we're going to soon see that these Sfalim have openings to them. And where are they located? The Shnei Sfalim are located on the western side. That's what we said, southwest. Correct? Okay. Good. Now, why are there two Sfalim? The answer is because we have two different mitzvahs. One is Nisach HaMayim and the other is Nisach HaYayim. So we need two different kelim for each one. Rabbi Yehuda Omer shel sid hay. Okay. Now, why Rabbi Yehuda insists that these bowls are made of sid? So there's a chiddush here of the person who maybe we have to thank that we are here together today. That's Rabbi Shapiro. And he says that the question is, if these bowls are going to be on the Mizbeach, then the Torah says that you're not allowed to put metal on the Mizbeach. The question is, does that include all metals? The Tanakama holds that it doesn't include all metals. It only applies to charbon, meaning you can't put a cherev on the Mizbeach because that represents death. The Mizbeach represents life, and a cherev is made of iron. But let's say, for example, gold or silver, that you can put directly onto the Mizbeach, according to Tanakh. Rabbi Yehuda expands the Iser to include all metals. So since you're going to lay down these sfolim on the Mizbeach and then pour the libations, then we can't allow for that possibility of placing any metal on the Mizbeach. Okay, for this Rabbi also, we'd have to learn the Midos and know more about the Mizbeach. When you pour water into a plaster kind of kli, the plaster, which is naturally white, turns dark. But the strange thing is that the Mishnah says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, both kelim, even the one that was designated for water, would turn dark. Why is that so? And that's going to lead us to this whole sugya about what happens if he puts the wine into the wrong kelim. Umenu kavin. And as we indicated earlier, these two kelim have holes on the bottom.